ago, before I even thought about being a pastor, and when Family Christian bookstores were still open and in business, I went over to the Family Christian bookstore in Maryville, and I was casually browsing the shelves, and a book caught my attention called The Me I Want to Be, Becoming God's Best Version of You by John Ortberg. So I decided to pick up that book, and I read it, and in reading it I found it was kind of an infomercial for a service that they were starting, where it was a dashboard that if you bought the book, you got a code, and you could log on. And so I did it, and it was a really good idea, but I think it was probably a little bit before its time, before the explosion of smartphones and things like that. And the idea was that you logged into this software and it gave you ideas for spiritual growth in different aspects of your life. So I tried it out, and I tried a few of the things. One of the things was memorizing some scripture, so I memorized a few verses. And one of the other suggestions for families was to, in order to teach your child charity and giving, to sponsor a child around your own child's age and to have your child communicate with that child. And so I decided to do that. I think Ethan was about 6 years old at the time. So we logged on to Children International and found a child about Ethan's age, and I had him help me decide, it sounds horrible, which child to help, but that's the way the website works. And so we started sponsoring this child named Jose. After a while, because we had sponsored for so long and we continued to sponsor the child, Children's International contacted me and asked if I would be willing to help get other children sponsored and talk to my friends to try and encourage them to sponsor. So I wasn't sure if I would be good at that or not, but I said okay, and they sent me a packet with about 2 or 3 children, and I tried to start talking to some of my friends about possibly sponsoring. And so I talked to a few friends of mine that I thought were in the place financially where they might be able to, spare an extra $25 or so. And I found that what was really awkward to me is that wealth is definitely a perception. The friends that I thought were in the best financial situation felt like they were too stretched financially to spare anything to give to any cause. And that was very awkward to me because I felt like I wasn't in a less, not to toot my own horn, but I felt less financially stable than some of these friends that I was approaching. And yet, I felt like I could spare that, but they didn't feel like that was within their ability to spare anything extra. I really don't like asking people for money. That's a very uncomfortable thing for me. I sold Mary Kay, and even though I loved the product, I felt like I was asking people to buy me. I liked it, and I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the makeup, but I didn't enjoy the selling part. That was just not my personality. I'm really horrible about school fundraisers, too. I would rather just give the PATT $20 than ask people to buy candles that cost $30 or six pieces of candy for $20 or things like that. It's just very uncomfortable for me. The trouble in the Bible today is that we have a rich man and a poor man. We don't know the rich man's name. All we know is that he dresses very well. And there's a poor man whose name we are actually given, Lazarus. The rich man, we know he dresses very well, and he eats very well. Lazarus, the language, sounds like he was dumped at the gate. So here's this man just dumped at the gate. We don't know why he's there or how he got there, but we know that he's hungry because he's longing to eat the crumbs that are the crumbs from the rich man's table. We are told that the dogs licked his wounds. Now, dogs overseas are not lovable pets. Dogs overseas are like large rodents. People are afraid of them because they don't have shots. And you might get rabies as one bites you or things like that. So these dogs coming up to him would not have been a desirable thing. But I think it's interesting that the dogs took mercy on Lazarus by licking his wounds and not the rich man. In 1949, a man named Vernon Johns, who was a pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, was taken to jail for advertising his sermon on this very Bible verse. He was the pastor of the same church that Martin Luther King Jr. preached at. He was one of the people who laid the foundation for Martin Luther King Jr. And the reason he got in trouble for this sermon was because in the next part of our story, both the rich man and the poor man die, and they both find themselves in the underworld. Now, the underworld, the image of the underworld back in this time was that there was a big dome, and that was the sky, and above the dome there was water, and here is the earth, and there's an underworld, and there's water below. And in this underworld, there is the place of suffering and the place of rest. And in between, there is a great chasm that cannot be crossed. And so in our story, God's, we may not have that view of the world anymore, but God speaks to people where they are at. And at this time in history, this is the way that the world is viewed. So we have the rich man in this place of suffering, and Lazarus in this place of rest with Abraham. And they cannot cross. They're segregated. And the name of Vernon John's sermon that day was called Segregation After Death. And so what happened is the police arrested him, and they took him to jail, and they asked him to preach exactly what he intended to say before they would let him go. His sermon was about how the rich man becomes known as Dives, which he is not named in the Bible, but traditionally people call him Dives because that means rich man. And even though he is in hell, he still thinks about the lines of prejudice. In this case, he's thinking like a rich man. One thing you may not have noticed is that even after death, he continues to see Lazarus as a servant or somebody beneath him. He has the gall to command Abraham to send Lazarus to relieve his suffering and to ask him to send Lazarus to talk to his brothers like a servant or like a slave. When Jesus tells the parable, another thing you may not have noticed is that the rich man actually knows Lazarus' name. When he's in hell, he's saying, command that guy Lazarus over there to go do this for me. So he was aware of him. He was not just some nameless person at the doorway. He was somebody that he knew well enough to know his name, but had chosen to just discard. We have just enough to make us blind to the poor. All of us are sort of in a state where we're comfortably numb. I doubt many of us would consider ourselves rich. Some may consider themselves poor, but it's more likely to be no expendable income, not truly poverty level poor. We know when we'll have our next meal. And compared to the rest of the world, each of us in this room is rich. But it's easier for us to see our deficits than it is to see our blessings. I have friends that grew up with less than I had, but because they were in poorer areas, they considered themselves rich, better off, or upper middle class. I have friends that grew up with pretty cushy upbringings, but because they were in more affluent communities, they considered themselves poor. I myself lived in Egypt for a year and a half, and I know I've mentioned that several times. Living there opened my eyes to a lot of things. One, there was a much lower standard of living. A lot of the people had a much higher education though, because education was free. It was granted, it was free from the government, just like regular education. You could go all the way through college. So what happened is you had a lot of people that were very well educated doing very low level jobs. You had engineers doing ironing or working as a seamstress. You had some doctors that were putting together drywall or sewing mattresses. When everyone around you is living on $200 to $300 a month, you feel pretty wealthy if you're making $600 a month. And transversely, when you're living over here, if you make $100,000 a year, you may feel at or below the average if you're surrounded by people making $500,000 a year. It's all very relative. We tend to judge ourselves by the people that we're surrounded by. Now, I didn't suffer when I was in Egypt. I had food to eat. Everyone saw me and saw how light-skinned I was and assumed I was rich. Because I'm American, and they know that we're used to making $40,000 to $60,000 a year average, when they're used to living on just a few hundred a month. I experienced firsthand the difference in the lifestyle. The biggest thing I missed was air conditioning. I missed mattresses that had springs. I did not like sleeping on futon-style beds. People didn't have access to water all day, even though they were in the city, because the water pressure would drop so much during the day. You had to have a little motor to pump the water up to the building. So if you were in a bad financial situation and you couldn't afford to run the electricity all day, you did not turn that water pump on. So you would go down and ask and hope that your neighbor was nice enough to let you get some water out of their house during the day, and hope that they're home during the day so that you can get a cup of water. McDonald's was for rich people. When you're living on the equivalent of $2 a day, a $2 French fry is expensive. So I knew high school kids that would save their money to go get a McDonald's French fry as a celebratory treat at the end of school. When I first came back, to see the disparity in the prices in American grocery stores was really difficult for me. Not because I had really suffered so much, but I knew how much that money could buy overseas. And the first time that I went grocery shopping, I had about $100, and I walked in, and I had spent that amount of money many times before, but when I walked in and I looked around, all I could see was what that would buy overseas. And it just was too much for me, and I had to go home, and I just cried a little bit. And eventually I got back to buying groceries. You have to buy groceries eventually. And I got used to it again. We do still have to survive in the surroundings and in the place that we are at. I felt so guilty, but I still had to live where I was planted. God grants grace to the poor man in our story, in a culture that views wealth as a sign of godliness and goodness. Whatever our ideology may be, Jesus establishes giving as a holy obligation. We are all rich in some way, even if we don't view ourselves that way. Some of us are rich in talent, musical talent, speaking talent. Some of us have resources that we can share, like a tractor to pull the hay rides when we have a picnic in the fall, or a gift to change light bulbs because they're not scared of heights, and some of us are. Some people have a knack for gardening, planning events, or cooking for a crowd. Some people like to do physical work and are good at it. And some people prefer to stay clean, but enjoy greeting people and being friendly and making others feel at home. Some of the most impactful ministries for the poor are carried out by poor, or people that may be considered poor, because they know what it's like to go without, and they're grateful to have enough to share. I've heard stories of churches taking up an anonymous offering for a family that they didn't want to name, and it turns out that the family didn't realize they were the ones that was being collected for, and they got together money to donate also, because they felt so bad to hear that that family was in such a poor position. The good news in this story, it's hard because this is one of those passages that's fire and brimstone, and I'm just not a fire and brimstone type person. I don't want to tell everybody that if you don't do this, you're going to go to that place of suffering. I like to see the good news in this story, and the good news is